Welcome back to Doctor Who The Cancelled Chronicles. Here we will wrap up Paul McGann's tenure as the Doctor in his final 2 seasons. Let's get started. The 36th season of Doctor Who started without much incident. Lewis Marks, Kate Orman, Paul McGann, Lisa Bowerman, and India Fisher all returned. In fact, Marks felt the old intro sequence was getting stale, so he opted for a new one. The logo and theme would look and sound something like this, and the face of McGann this time would be included. However, during production, Marks announced rather suddenly that this would be his final season as producer, as he felt overworked in the role. The BBC hadn't planned for this and were quite surprised by the announcement. However, later on, which was planned, Bowerman announced that this would be her final season as a companion, as she felt 4 seasons had been enough. But outside of people leaving, the story count would go back up to 8, and that would be all. The first story is The Next Doctor, written by Russell T Davies. It's in 1851, and the Cybermen stalk Victorian London. The Doctor, Charlie, and Bernice discover a spate of mysterious deaths, and they're surprised to meet another Doctor. Are 2 Doctors enough to stop the rise of the Cyber King? So this would be an adaptation of the New Who story of the same name. Obviously, some things would change, like this time there would actually be companions, it wouldn't take place around Christmas, and there would be no Miss Hartigan character. The threat would just be the Cybermen, and that's it. Also, the Cyber King wouldn't be this gigantic steampunk kaiju-looking thing. It would be more like a gigantic machine with human body parts and systems inside it. Something that would take up a room, like the computers of the 1960s. And the kidnapped children would be working inside the machine to help it run and eventually have the Cyber King take over. And then finally, the fan cast favorite Doctor to play Jackson Lake would be Hugh Grant. The story would have been overall praised and many liked seeing the Cybermen again. However, many didn't like the new Cyber King character and felt he was superfluous. But many praised Grant as Jackson Lake and loved his camaraderie with the Doctor, Bernice, and Charlie. The second story is Planet of the Dead, written by Gareth Roberts. When a London bus takes a detour to an alien world, the Doctor must join forces with the extraordinary Lady Christina after being separated from his companions. But the mysterious planet holds terrifying secrets, and time is running out as the deadly swarm gets closer. Another New Who adaptation. However, this one would have less changes than the previous one, with the only addition being that Bernice and Charlie would be separated from the Doctor, and their subplot would involve them trying to get back to him with the TARDIS, as well as the unit officers in this being Brigadier Bombera instead of Captain Arisa Magambo and Jonathan Hooper instead of Malcolm Taylor. Also, since Lady Christina in our universe was essentially the Rain Cunningham we never actually got, here there would be some comment about her and Rain being similar, and the Doctor lamenting over a lost companion, maybe even being a bit too protective of her at certain points. The story would have gotten mixed reception. While some liked the Lady Christina character, the fun story, and the inclusion of Bombera and Hooper, others felt that the story was too generic, and that the subplot with Charlie and Bernice felt like filler. The third story is The Doomed City, written by Andy Lane. The TARDIS arrives in a city that is overflowing with water. The Doctor, Bernice, and Charlie are all separated from the TARDIS as it dematerializes out of danger. The Doctor and company must go up and up and up and up, and hope to not be drowned along with the city. This essentially would have been a 1-episode filler story. It's a ticking clock story where the TARDIS crew land in a city that has since been evacuated. All that we know is that the water is rising, the TARDIS dematerializes out of danger due to the water having a certain quality that could be poisonous to the TARDIS, but not necessarily to the crew. So they pretty much have to get all the way up to the top of this tower where the TARDIS is. It would have been a swiftly paced episode that would have used the lack of multiple episodes to its advantage. Eventually the TARDIS crew get out of there with some close calls and eventually leave. The story would have been praised. While many didn't like the fact it was a filler story, many majorly commended the use of it only being one episode and made it a fast-paced and enjoyable adventure. Many considered it the best one-episode story ever since they were reintroduced into the show during the 8th Doctor era. The fourth story is Tomb of Rassilon, written by Mark Platt. The Doctor receives a distress signal from Gallifrey. It's coming from the Tomb of Rassilon. The Doctor must return to the tomb once again and await the horrors inside and try to figure out if the long-dead Rassilon sent the distress signal. The story would have involved the Doctor going back to Gallifrey, as Romana and the Time Lords have found a distress signal somehow coming from Rassilon's tomb. It would be the Doctor, Bernice, and Charlie venturing into the tomb and combating the various failsafes and booby traps for the tomb. That would essentially be the first episode. The second episode would involve actually getting into the tomb, with a wink and a nod to the 5 Doctors, of course, and seeing who actually called for the distress signal. It would be a bit of a mystery until it is eventually revealed that a Time Lord named Tecteun, who looks like an old hermit, sent the distress signal. She wants the Doctor and company to help her free Rassilon to take over Gallifrey, as she was his assistant back in the early days of Gallifrey. Through the rest of the story, the Doctor tries hard to figure out a plan to stop this from happening, as well as showcasing some ideas about Gallifreyan lore and the sort. The Doctor eventually manages to bring Rassilon back, but thanks to his companions, managed to rewire the failsafes and booby traps to keep Rassilon in, so bringing him back was entirely useless, to the fury of both him and Tecteun. The Doctor and company managed to flee, and after a quick conversation with Romana, leave in the TARDIS. The story would have been favorable, mainly with the ideas of Gallifrey's past, seeing Romana again, and that sort. However, the main story lost its luster by the end and probably shouldn't have been 3 episodes. The fifth story is The Dying Days, written by Lance Parkin. On the Mare Serenum, British astronauts are walking on the surface of Mars for the first time in over 20 years. The National Space Museum in London is the venue for a spectacular event where the great and the good celebrate a unique British achievement. In Adasham, Kent, the most dangerous man in Britain has escaped from custody while being transported by helicopter. In Whitehall, the new Home Secretary is convinced that there is a plot brewing to overthrow the government. In West London, MI5 agents shut down a publishing company that got too close to the top-secret organization known as UNIT. And on a state visit to Washington, the British Prime Minister prepares to make a crucial speech, totally unaware that dark forces are working against him. As the Doctor, Charlie, and Bernice discover, all these events are connected. However, soon all will be overshadowed. This time, the Doctor is already too late. This would essentially be an adaptation of the novel, with some things trimmed for time, as well as the opening changing to remove any reference to Bernice's history, her marriage, or anything of the sort, and then the fact that she performed the Devil's Tango with the Doctor at the end of the novel. Yes, that apparently happened for those who don't know, but we're getting rid of that so we don't have to worry about it. And then General Lethbridge Stewart would then cameo here as well, and Charlie's involvement would be rather small by comparison. Bombera's role would also be shortened due to the ongoing arc in UNIT at the time, as well as the lack of celebrity cameos. The story would have received a ton of praise, mainly with the inclusion of the Ice Warriors after so long, Lethbridge Stewart returning, and the epic scale. However, it still felt small enough to make it work, and Parkin did a great job at writing the characters. The sixth story is The Frozen Planet, written by Paul Cornell. There is a planet in the far reaches of the universe that has since become entirely frozen, due to no sun. But somehow there are survivors on the planet, 2 of which are named Charlie and Bernice. They tell stories of a man named the Doctor who is coming to save them. Or they can only hope. Pretty much the entire first episode involves Bernice and Charlie being on this planet, and it's them telling the small group of people still trapped on this planet stories of the Doctor and how they're friends with him. Anytime they're alone, they both formulate about how they will contact the Doctor and try to get home. Bernice wonders where they are in the solar system and how this planet can really survive without a sun. In the final minutes of the episode, it's revealed to be a test simulation run by an advanced alien race to test humans in certain environments. The second episode would pretty much take place from the Doctor's point of view trying to rescue them. It would be a rather conventional story. The story would have been considered mixed. Many loved the intrigue of the first episode, however the twist and second episode is where the intrigue dropped dramatically. Fans found the twist to be predictable and the second episode to be rather boring. Because of this, the story was not considered wholly interesting. The seventh story is The Twilight Kingdom, written by Will Schindler. The blood of innocents has been spilt. A terrible sequence of events has been set in motion. The forces of darkness are on the move. Deep underground, an army of light prepares itself for the oncoming war. The Doctor is used to winning, stumbling in, reading the face of the enemy, and then beating the odds, but what if this time he's got it wrong? Charlie and Bernice think he has. Stripped of all that is familiar, just who is the Doctor? Major Koth thinks he knows. Lost among the dark caverns of an unknown world, as the Doctor finally met his match. The story would have been adapted from the Big Finish audio of the same name, however there would be some major tweaks considering this is a part of the Divergent Universe arc, so those aspects would be heavily downplayed or removed. Bernice would take Chris's role here as well. The story would have received mainly negative reception due to the uneven tone, an uninteresting and boring storyline, and some characters to be written rather poorly. The eighth and final story is So Vile a Sin, written by Kate Orman. The Earth Empire, the Imperium Humanum, upon which 1,000 suns never set, is dying. The great houses of the Empire maneuver a scheme for advantage. Alliances are made, and knives flash in the shadows. Out among the moons of Jupiter, another battle is just beginning, as an ancient brotherhood seeks limitless power and long overdue revenge. The Doctor returns to the 30th century, searching for the source of a terrifying weapon. He fears a nightmare from his own past may be about to destroy the future. Nothing must be allowed to get in his way. But the Doctor has reckoned without the power of history, which has its own plans for the wayward daughter of the House of Forrester. So the final story this season would be the epic and technically final VNA, however some things would have to be majorly tweaked. Roz and Chris would pretty much just be small supporting characters here, and it would be Bernice to be the one that dies rather than Roz, since Roz would only be introduced here, and Bernice would have been the ongoing companion. She gets brainwashed to make her believe she is a soldier, and she is killed on the battlefield in the same way that Roz was. The story would have received monumental praise, with having a grand epic story and a great yet heartbreaking end for Bernice. Characters Roz and Chris were also praised for being memorable side characters. Many felt that the ending with Charlie leaving the Doctor to be alone in his TARDIS to be rather powerful. Season 36 would be considered a good season. Not as good as Season 35, but it still would have been praised. After the season was finished, it was announced that this would be Kate Orman's final season as script editor, and that Lance Parkin would be her replacement, which many fans were happy about due to his previous stories being praised. It would also be announced that the producer for Season 37 would be Jonathan P. Llewellyn. After the mass exodus of Marks, Bowerman, and Orman after Season 36, it was decided that Season 37 would be Paul McGann's last as the Ninth Doctor. Initially, India Fisher was going to be a companion for the next Doctor, but Lance Parkin convinced Llewellyn to get rid of her by the end of the season, as he had a plan for the next Doctor that did not include her. Fisher was disappointed, but she ultimately agreed and stepped down as Charlie, with Season 37 being her final season as well. It was also announced that due to some leaks, the next Doctor would actually be a woman, as well as the season having 24 episodes instead of 22. Time to get into McGann's final season. The first story is Embrace the Darkness, written by Nicholas Briggs. The Doctor and Charlie encounter an ancient race in the Sumerian system, whose return could prove apocalyptic. But as the darkness envelops the station, the Doctor learns that their seemingly evil acts might be more than they appear. To save the day, the Doctor must battle an artificial intelligence as well as the Sumerians. This would be an adaptation of the Big Finish story. Due to the fact that rights would not be an issue, the Morestrans would be used instead of the Throxilians in the story as originally intended. But that's about it. The story would have been considered favorable. While McGann and Fisher were on top form, as well as the creepy atmosphere, dark tone, and intriguing villain, many felt that the plot was weak. The second story is Absolute Zero, written by David Renwick. The Doctor and Charlie come across a body in an alley. It's cold to the touch, but colder than normal. The Doctor decides to play detective to figure out who killed them, but the Doctor might have fallen into something more than he bargained for. It's essentially a basic detective story, but with a slight alien influence. The killer in question is an alien who sucks away all blood and heat from the victim, almost like a vampire of sorts. It leaves behind a certain type of residue that almost freezes the victim to almost 0 degrees Kelvin, hence the name of the episode. However, most of the episode would still be a regular detective story. The story would have received a considerable amount of praise due to the bare-bones nature of it, and offering something quite different as opposed to the many alien adventure stories that McGann's era is known for. Third story is Wandering from Another World, written by Stephen Cole. On Earth in the 1700s, the Doctor enters a graveyard with Charlie and he hears tons and tons of voices, but he doesn't know where they're coming from. It turns out that they're beings from purgatory trying to get back to Earth. Perhaps. through the bodies they once occupied. Similar to what came before, this is simply a zombie story mixed with a bit of a ghost story. It is somewhat reminiscent of The Unquiet Dead, but not exactly like that. The villains would still be categorized as zombies when they do technically rise from the dead. The beings in question are lost souls from purgatory, but they are from another planet, which would have been the twist of the story. It combines various aspects into one simple story, with the Doctor trying to find these beings a resting place, or to expel them back into purgatory. There is some morality there, because there is a reason as to why they escaped, so it might be more of a hell than the actual hell. Purgatory is also described as some sort of mysterious dimension that the Doctor was unaware of until now. The story would have received a good amount of praise, not as much as the previous story, as many felt that the simplistic story and setting worked better there. However, many still found it to be rather intriguing. The fourth story is Return of the Celestial Toymaker, written by Lance Parkin. The Doctor and Charlie head to Blackpool, where they visit an amusement park that is entirely empty. They have fallen into the trap of an ancient being that the Doctor has fought once before, the Celestial Toymaker. The Doctor must once again play his fierce and nightmarish games to save himself and Charlie, or doom all of them and the planet. The story would have been a very, 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 very rough and loose adaptation of the Graham Williams story, The Nightmare Fair. However, after the first episode being a much more straight adaptation of the first part of the original story, it goes for more of a meta approach, with the rest of the story commenting on the fact that this was supposed to be done with the 6th Doctor and Perry, rather than the 9th Doctor and Charlie. The Toymaker tries to make sure to get the story to the original specifications, even going so far as to dress them up like that TARDIS team and have 9 act more like 6. It would show the Toymaker with proper power and how he truly is to be a feared, omnipotent being. It would eventually involve the Doctor outsmarting the Toymaker and him and Charlie leaving in the TARDIS. Also, the explanation as to why he is so old is that after he quote-unquote died originally, he could only come back with a fraction of his power, which is still a lot, and because of this, he has this older appearance. The story would have been an intriguing one, to say the least. While many liked the intriguing meta concepts, some felt that it was too much and didn't work, especially when the Toymaker dresses them up as Six and Perry. However, some felt that the story was still quite good and liked that the Toymaker was less of an offensive stereotype. The fifth story is Beyond the Grey Eyes, written by Russell T. Davies. The Doctor and companions visit a planet where there are no shades of grey, only good and evil, yes and no, black and white. You are either right or wrong, and the Doctor and Charlie find themselves to be very, very wrong. So this would essentially be a morality type of episode. On this planet, you can only be right or wrong. There isn't such a thing as maybe, or it depends, or anything of the sort. The Doctor and Charlie land on the world and do something that is very inconsequential normally. However, it is something that of course angers the people of this world, and the Doctor and Charlie become trapped on this planet. They have to fight for their lives, and it really showcases the power of the Doctor's words, and how intelligent he really is. How this culture is different from Earth, and if the Doctor can actually change this world, or if he would have to find a way through their culture and society. Eventually, the Doctor manages to earn the right to leave the planet, but he and Charlie must never return due to their actions. The story would have received praise as a downplayed morality episode that deals with argumentative discussion on not being able to see outside of right and wrong. Despite it not feeling like a Doctor Who episode in many ways, many felt that its concept and themes were extremely interesting, even if the story could be a bit dull at points. The sixth story is Nevermore, written by Alan Barnes. The Doctor and Charlie land in Baltimore, Maryland, 1849. They eventually come across the famous author, Edgar Allan Poe. The Doctor soon realizes that he is destined to die in just a few days, and it turns out a horrifying creature is trying to transform the world into Poe's stories, and might have been more connected to Poe than either of them realized. I would like to clarify that this is not an adaptation of the Big Finish story of the same name, although in universe that would have been the original idea before Barnes came up with this story. This would pretty much be a pseudo-historical involving an alien who calls itself Rannals, and who in fact was a parasitic organism on Poe before it eventually separated and evolved into its own being. He then starts reenacting certain aspects of Poe's stories in order to make reality more like the mind of Poe, so the organism can properly thrive outside of the host body. Eventually, the Doctor and Charlie enter the story and try to help with the situation by stopping the organism through various means. Throughout the story, it's revealed that Poe is slowly dying due to the parasite separating from him, as he had been with Poe pretty much his entire life. Eventually, in the final episode, Poe and the Doctor are chasing after Rannals, where Poe becomes too weak and sits on a park bench. The doctor soon realizes that Poe is found here and taken to the hospital where he dies. As much as it pains him, the doctor must not mess with history, and he leaves Poe on the bench and tells him he will find Reynolds and capture him. He leaves Poe as he says the name over and over again, and other such gibberish. The doctor eventually finds Reynolds along with Charlie. The doctor offers himself as a host body to help him, and Reynolds denies it. The doctor eventually is forced to kill him. Despite this, the damage is done, and it's too late to save Poe. On October 7th, in the very early hours of the morning, the doctor and Charlie visit the dying Poe and tell him Reynolds is taken care of. But it's too late to save him. Poe understands, and the doctor tells him that he will still be remembered through his stories for generations to come. Poe manages to have a momentary bout of sanity and says, "The greatest death, Doctor, is not a permanent one," and he smiles. The doctor and Charlie then leave in the TARDIS as Poe looks on in amazement. The story would have been massively praised in one of the best pseudo-historicals of the era and possibly of all time. The chemistry between the doctor and Poe would have been a highlight, as well as Poe's dark humor and sarcasm, as well as the villain whose plan and alien biology were seen as intriguing. The seventh story is The Greater Good, written by Paul Cornell. The doctor and Charlie pick up a young woman who is supposed to die that very night, but the doctor does what he can to try and save her. But is it worth the cost? This would be another morality tale involving fixed points in time and whether the doctor can save a life where, if he does so, will cause disastrous results for the timeline. The doctor and Charlie accidentally pick up a woman named Nancy Glenn who is running away from a notorious serial killer. For most of the first episode, they are discussing what they should do with Nancy, and the doctor is kind of dodging the subject. He wants to pretty much bring her on as a companion, but not really outright saying it. Then he decides that they need some rest and relaxation to think about it. Charlie knows the doctor knows something that he isn't telling them, but decides to go along with whatever he's planning for now. For the second episode, it diverges and they try to go to a pleasure planet, but they eventually crash land at some sort of futuristic industrial/maintenance building. It's been run over by the Khatomer, an alien race whose main weakness is high decibels, which is figured out by screaming. A small adventure happens and the aliens are eventually defeated by the sonic screwdriver, replicating high decibel noises with plenty of character moments that foreshadow the end of the story. They soon leave. The third episode is the doctor delaying the inevitable with mainly Charlie, but also Nancy prodding him to get him to tell them what he's been hiding. The doctor states that Nancy was destined to die the night she ran into the TARDIS, and her death causes the serial killer chasing her to be shot and killed by a veteran police officer in the woods. Charlie asks what happens if she doesn't die. He states that 13 other women will die before he is eventually caught and given life in prison, where he additionally kills 3 other inmates with lesser crimes. Charlie berates him and they try to have a discussion about it until Nancy decides that she is willing to sacrifice herself to save all 16 people. The doctor pleads with her that they will find another way, but deep down knows that the needs of the many outweighs the needs of the one. The doctor tells her what happened so that history can remain on track, and she leaves. It plays out how it is supposed to happen, and the doctor and Charlie leave. The TARDIS is quiet for a couple minutes until Charlie states, "I have to go now too, don't I?" The doctor again tries to ignore this, but Charlie was somewhat inspired by Nancy's sacrifice and that she also must correct her timeline as well. The doctor says that he can't lose her. He's already lost so many. He needs to save her. The universe can right itself. But Charlie states that this needs to happen. He begrudgingly inputs the coordinates, and they have a very tearful goodbye. He tries to convince her to stay one more time, but Charlie just says, "Goodbye, Doctor," and leaves the TARDIS. It dematerializes from Charlie's point of view as the doctor refuses to look at the TARDIS screen in Charlie's final moments. The final shot is of the doctor alone in his TARDIS, standing by the console, depressed and defeated. The story would have been mostly praised. Many felt that episode 1 and 3 were excellent, but felt the second episode was almost superfluous despite having many great character moments. The 8th and final story is The Vessel of Immortality, written by Steve Lyons. The doctor finds a ship floating in space. When inside, he sees the people on the ship happy and carefree, despite the doctor finding out that the ship is millennia old. What's causing it? Well, the doctor's curiosity might just be the end of him. We have finally reached the final story of the 9th Doctor's tenure. This would have the Doctor be companionless for the entire story, and him coming across a ship called the USS Prometheus that looks old, rotted, and disgusting on the outside. The Doctor believes that it shouldn't even function and that it's millennia old. His curiosity gets the better of him despite him still feeling the consequences of the previous story. He lands inside and he sees a fully functioning spaceship that looks like a resort of sorts. All the people inside are blissfully unaware of the dangers that face him on the outside. The first episode is mainly the Doctor discovering all of this and how he should proceed. The second episode would mainly be the Doctor trying to warn people in charge about the outside of the ship, while also trying to figure out what caused it. In the cliffhanger, it's revealed to be a time cluster. He eventually manages to convince an engineer on board that on the outside, the ship is extremely old and that they need to find some sort of evidence to convince everybody else. There's even added urgency because the Doctor finds out that the time cluster has returned and they're heading straight for it and they can't diverge. It would reverse the effects by making everything on the inside of the ship very old and everything on the outside pristine, meaning everyone inside would die of extremely old age. The Doctor and the engineer managed to convince the pilot that this is the case with the evidence the engineer found. They managed to evacuate almost everyone except that one of the lifeboats is faulty and won't be able to get the last of the people off the ship. So the Doctor has the idea to put them all in the TARDIS and deadlock it so that it isn't affected by the cluster. However, this can only be done on the outside with the TARDIS key and Sonic. The Doctor realizes what must be done. Everyone manages to get inside the TARDIS and he manages to deadlock it. They go through the time cluster and everything around the Doctor gets significantly older and decayed. He also gets older and older and older to the point where he is barely recognizable. He comments about how much older he's getting, how 10 is a quote-unquote big number, and that he wishes Charlie was here. He begins to cry as a golden glow surrounds him and he begins to regenerate. Before we see the new Doctor, it cuts to the inside of the TARDIS with about 100 people looking scared and worried. The door then opens and we see a figure almost crawling into the TARDIS. The engineer who helped him earlier says, "Doctor, are you okay?" The figure then says, "Yes, my dear. A little worse for wear, but I'll be alright." She looks up and smiles, and we see Fiona Shaw as the 10th Doctor. This story would have been praised, but many felt it was overly long and didn't feel as epic as it should have been, like the regeneration felt tacked on more than anything. However, McGann was, as always, praised and liked his regeneration scene, as well as the story having some interesting bits throughout. Season 37 would have been considered an overall successful end to the Paul McGann era. Jonathan P. Llewellyn announced that he would be leaving after this season to move on to the revival of Absolutely Fabulous, as he was never really serious about being producer of Doctor Who and viewed it as a temporary position. It's because of this another outside producer was hired by the BBC for the next era of Doctor Who, Steve Lanning. He already started working closely with Lance Parkin for the 10th Doctor era, and they already had a tight-knit arc for the next Doctor. Paul McGann's era would be seen as incredibly successful, and was the era that really made Doctor Who become popular once again. The Rowan Atkinson era set the groundwork, while the McGann era built upon it properly, as well as starting to gain some popularity in America thanks to the newly launched BBC America channel. However, that is it for this video. Fiona Shaw is our new Doctor, and we will be covering her first 2 seasons in July, while next month we will be covering season 3 and 4 of Unit. See you then.